What if the fate of an entire nation depended on a man who could never have heirs, whose very identity had been shaped by a cruel blade? In the heart of ancient Egypt, where the pharaoh's power was absolute and conspiracies lurked around every corner, a single eunuch named Kemet found himself at the center of a plot that could alter the course of history. But was he ready to face the dark forces threatening not only the throne but his own life? Today, we're diving into a story of power, betrayal, and an unexpected choice that could change everything. In the shadowy halls of ancient Egypt, where the scorching sun barely penetrated the stone chambers of the palaces, a silent figure moved through the darkness. This was Kemet, a trusted eunuch of the pharaoh, the keeper of the throne's deepest secrets. Ever since he had been castrated at a young age, Kemet lived under the promise of absolute power, but always at the cost of something more precious than gold: his very identity. No one knew for certain how he had risen to the position of captain of the guard. Rumors swirled among the servants and nobles of the court. Some said that Kemet, with his impenetrable demeanor and sharp eyes, was born of divine lineage, while others believed he was just another victim of palace intrigue. But one thing was clear: he knew more than any man in that court, perhaps even more than the pharaoh himself. Deep within the royal archives, a scroll was kept, a document sealed for decades, forbidden even to the eyes of the closest to the throne. It was said that the scroll contained a secret capable of shaking Egypt, a truth buried beneath layers of history and power. Was it a curse, prophecy, or a carefully orchestrated conspiracy? During his nights of solitude, Kemet often wondered what lay beyond the power he had been given. Despite his prestigious position, something always gnawed at him, as if his life were just a pawn in a much larger game, played by unseen hands. And it was then that he began to suspect that the scroll held answers not only to the mysteries of the kingdom but to his own existence. However, his path to the truth was far from simple. The palace was a labyrinth of secrets, where alliances crumbled in a blink, and betrayals were crafted in the silence of midnight. Every glance Kemet received, every whispered word in the shadows, was a reminder that he was surrounded by a sea of uncertainties. And at the heart of that uncertainty, a new mystery was unfolding. A conspiracy involving the pharaoh's own court. Someone wanted the throne, and they would stop at nothing to get it. Kemet knew he was getting close to something big. This story wasn't just about him, but about the fate of an entire nation. Now, he was on the brink of uncovering a controversy that, if revealed, could upend the balance of power in Egypt. As he walked silently through the palace chambers, the sound of his sandals echoing off the stone walls, he could feel it. The first move had already been made. The game board was set and the first piece had been played. This was the beginning of a journey that would test his loyalty, his strength, and above all, his very soul. The mystery was only just beginning. The nights in Thebes were as silent as they were treacherous. However, within the halls of the court, power moved invisibly, like the current of the Nile. While the moon gazed down from above, intrigues gathered strength in every corner. For Kemet, political maneuvering was like a delicate dance. Every gesture, every word had meaning. He knew that in Egypt, strength wasn't just in armies, but in the control of knowledge, in secrets. Castration, which had taken from Kemet the possibility of heirs and descendants, had turned him into the perfect tool in the pharaoh's hands. Without family ties, he was seen as a loyal servant, incapable of rivaling or desiring a dynasty of his own. But Kemet knew that power in Egypt wasn't so simple. He watched the nobles, the advisors, even the priests who moved between the palace and the temples. All of them, with their finely embroidered robes, carried in their eyes the hunger for something more. It was political survival, and at the center of this game was him. At that moment, Kemet walked through the winding corridors toward the Temple of Ammonius, where the priests conducted rituals that connected the throne to the Egyptian deities. The pharaoh relied on the oracles and divine signs to justify his decisions, but Kemet knew that behind the incense and offerings, there was another truth. The priests held overwhelming influence over the throne, whispering promises and prophecies that shaped the kingdom's fate. Upon reaching the temple doors, he encountered Amunhotep, the high priest. His words were sweet, but his intentions always seemed hidden under layers of formality. Amenhotep smiled as he saw Kemet approach, but there was a calculating gleam in his eyes. "Kemet, guardian of the pharaoh," he said, with an exaggerated bow. "What brings you to the temple in the dead of night?" "The gods do not sleep, high priest," Kemet replied, without breaking eye contact. "And neither do those who guard the throne." Amenhotep let out a soft laugh, but there was something unsettling in the air. They both knew they stood on opposite sides of an invisible battlefield. Kemet had long suspected that the priests, led by Amenhotep, were infiltrating the pharaoh's decisions. They planted seeds of doubt and used their position to manipulate the course of the government. "You are wise, Kemet," the high priest continued, guiding him further into the temple. "But know that even wisdom cannot resist the will of the gods." As they walked between the towering columns of the temple, Kemet felt the weight of his position. He was a tool in the hands of power, but at the same time a solitary player in a dangerous game. With each step, he saw the symbols etched into the walls, ancient stories of kings and conquerors, reminding him that in Egypt, power didn't lie solely in swords, but in beliefs, rituals, and the manipulation of ideas. "Tell me, Amenhotep," Kemet finally broke the silence. "Do you really believe that the gods speak only to the priests? Or do they speak to those who have the power to shape Egypt's destiny?" Amenhotep stopped, turning slowly to face Kemet. His eyes were dark, as if weighing every word before responding. "The gods speak to whom they choose, Kemet, but who are we to question their will?" He leaned in a little closer. "The question is, are you ready to listen?" Kemet, with his sharp mind, knew that Amenhotep was testing him. The priests wanted to know how much he understood, how far his suspicions went. And it was clear that the power of the temple intertwined with the decisions of the throne in ways the pharaoh could never imagine. The balance of the kingdom depended on these quiet alliances, these half-lit conversations. And Kemet knew that if he wanted to survive in this game of power, he would have to move with the same calculated precision as Amenhotep. The game of manipulation had only just begun. As the priests' whispered rituals echoed through the temple, Kemet realized that true power in Egypt didn't come from brute force or royal blood, but from knowledge, the secrets each person kept hidden. And more than anyone else, he was about to uncover the truth behind a conspiracy that stretched beyond the palace walls and reached into the very heart of the gods. The time for easy decisions was over. Kemet now stood at the center of a web that entangled not just the pharaoh, but the entire kingdom. Amenhotep's words continued to echo in Kemet's mind as he left the temple. "Are you ready to listen?" The question lingered over him like a shadow, forcing him to confront something he had always feared: the conflict between the power he wielded and the identity that had been stripped from him. Kemet was no longer just a loyal servant, no longer just an unyielding soldier. He was a man at a crossroads, where his loyalty to the pharaoh clashed with the secrets he uncovered each day. As he walked through the palace corridors, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Not by human eyes, but by something greater, something invisible and intangible, as though fate itself was observing his every move. The palace, once a place of structure and order, now closed in on him with walls of uncertainty. He no longer knew who his allies were, or if he could even trust himself. Within him, Kemet wrestled with the reality of his condition. His castration had granted him power, but at the cost of a part of his identity he could never reclaim. Who was he, really? A servant with no future, no heirs, no chance of leaving a legacy? Or was he something more? The trusted eunuch, shaped by destiny to hold the threads of a plot that went beyond the pharaoh's control? As these thoughts consumed him, the tension mounted. He began to realize that his position of power, though strong, was fragile. A eunuch could not claim a throne, could not build a dynasty. His only currency was loyalty to the crown, but the crown wasn't always loyal to him. The pharaoh saw him as a useful tool, but one easily discarded. The priests viewed him as a piece in a much larger game. And Kemet? He began to see himself as something in between, the piece that could decide the endgame. The days at the palace grew more tense. Rumors of conspiracies ran through the halls, and Kemet found himself at the center of it all. Amunhotep was drawing closer to the pharaoh with promises of divine visions, but Kemet knew those visions were crafted to serve the temple's interests. The pharaoh, meanwhile, began to distrust everyone around him, including Kemet. The pharaoh's doubt hung over Kemet like a sword. The unwavering loyalty he had always shown was now being tested, and for the first time, Kemet found himself questioning whether that loyalty was still worth it. If his identity had been shaped by the lack of personal power, by the castration that left him impotent, both literally and symbolically, was he capable of redefining his life? Could he find a form of power beyond servitude? One night, restless and uncertain, Kemet was summoned to the pharaoh's presence. The great throne hall was empty, save for the monarch, who stared blankly ahead with an expression of deep uncertainty. As Kemet approached, the pharaoh slowly turned, his eyes locking onto those of his captain of the guard. "Kemet!" The pharaoh's voice was low, almost wavering. "Tell me, what do you see?" Kemet remained silent, trying to decipher what the pharaoh truly wanted to hear. He wasn't asking about the palace or about the political situation. He was asking something deeper, something that involved not just the throne, but the very essence of power and control. "I see uncertainty, Your Majesty," Kemet responded cautiously. "Power is fragile, and those who surround it are unstable. Loyalty fades into the shadows." The pharaoh nodded slowly, as though he already knew the answer. "And you, Kemet?" The pharaoh continued, his voice now more penetrating. "What do you seek in the end?" Kemet felt the weight of the question more than any other. For his entire life, he had served without question, his destiny shaped by others. But now, standing before the most powerful ruler in the world, he realized that the real question wasn't what he sought for the kingdom. It was what he sought for himself. "I seek," Kemet hesitated, his words laden with a truth he had hidden even from himself. "I seek control over my own fate." The pharaoh remained silent, as though the answer was enough. But Kemet knew that this moment marked the beginning of a larger conflict, not just between him and the court, but within himself. He could no longer be just the loyal servant. The desire for power, for identity, was now growing inside him, and the palace wasn't big enough to contain that struggle. And in that moment, Kemet understood that the true conflict wasn't just in the politics of power that governed Egypt, but in the battle for the soul of a man who, for so long, had been shaped by the destiny of others. The days following that conversation with the pharaoh brought a change within Kemet. Something inside him had begun to awaken. He realized that although his life had been shaped by external forces, the blade that robbed him of his future, the court's intrigues, and the whispers of the priests, he still held the power to decide how to respond to it all. And in that moment of clarity, something greater seemed to be at work. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the palace grew more tense. The pharaoh was growing ill, and the advisors, like jackals circling prey, began positioning themselves. Among them, Amunhotep stood out the most, pushing the pharaoh to accept the temple's rituals as a cure. But Kemet knew that salvation for the kingdom would not come from the priests or the nobles. He felt, almost divinely, that a greater force was guiding his path. One night, while Kemet meditated in the empty corridors of the palace, he was startled by a figure emerging from the shadows. An elderly man with a serene gaze, dressed simply. The man walked toward him with the calmness of someone unafraid of the powerful. "Are you ready to listen, Kemet?" the elder asked, his voice filled with wisdom. The question echoed like a reminder of Amunhotep's words. But this time there was something different. It wasn't a test of power or manipulation. It was as if this man knew that Kemet was on a journey toward something greater, something that transcended the political games of Egypt. "Who are you?" Kemet asked, intrigued. "I am merely a messenger," the elder replied, his eyes glowing in the torchlight. "But the message I bring is not for the pharaoh. It is for you." A chill ran down Kemet's spine. For his entire life, he had believed that his fate was in the hands of others, that his power was limited to his loyalty. But somehow, this encounter felt different. It was as if the universe itself was conspiring in his favor. "You have been forged by fire, Kemet," the elder continued, his voice now firmer. "You were stripped of your inheritance, but not your purpose. Everything that has happened so far has been preparing you for the moment when your true strength will be revealed." Kemet felt the words sink deep, like a truth he had always known but had never fully accepted. For so long, he had felt incomplete, powerless, at the mercy of greater forces. But now, standing before this stranger, he understood that his life was not a series of random events. It was a path guided by something divine. "And what is that purpose?" Kemet whispered. The elder smiled softly, leaning in closer. "Egypt is about to face a crisis that neither the priests nor the nobles can resolve. The fate of the kingdom is in your hands, Kemet. You will be the instrument of change, the invisible hand that guides the pharaoh and the people toward salvation. But to do so, you must trust in what lies beyond what your eyes can see. The favor of the gods is upon you, but the path will be difficult." Before Kemet could respond, the elder disappeared into the shadows, leaving only the echo of his words in the air. The journey Kemet had started, once filled with uncertainty, now had a clear purpose. He was no longer just the pharaoh's eunuch, shaped by the blade and palace intrigues. He was an agent of something greater, a destiny he had never imagined. In the days that followed, Kemet began to see how everything fit together. The pharaoh, weakened by illness, called upon him for counsel more frequently. Amenhotep, on the other hand, continued pressuring for the temple to seize control. But Kemet, guided by the revelation he had received, began to act in secret. He gathered a group of advisors and generals who remained loyal to the pharaoh but were wary of the growing influence of the priests. Together, they formed a silent alliance, plotting actions to strengthen the throne and ensure the kingdom's survival. Now more than ever, Kemet felt he was being guided by unseen forces, as though every step he took had been predestined. And then, at the height of the crisis, when the pharaoh was on the verge of death and the temple was poised to take control, Kemet made his move. With the support of the generals, he removed Amenhotep and the priests from the circle of decision-making. In a bold but necessary act, he reorganized the royal guard and strengthened the palace defenses, ensuring that the transition of power would occur without interference from those seeking to exploit the kingdom's vulnerability. In the end, the pharaoh recovered, and Kemet was celebrated as the silent savior of the throne. He needed no titles, no inheritance. The divine favor was upon him, and his journey of overcoming had reached its peak. Kemet, the eunuch who had once been shaped by the power of others, now shaped the fate of an entire nation. And so, he realized that his true strength did not lie in what had been taken from him, but in what he had chosen to become. The stillness of the night in the palace felt heavy, as if the air itself was laden with untold secrets. Kemet knew that his recent victory was only the beginning of something much larger. The divine favor that had guided him this far also served as a warning. The conspiracy he had thwarted was far from completely dismantled. The halls, once his domain of tranquility, now oppressed him with a constant sense of watchfulness. He knew that after his decisive intervention, the forces he had challenged were regrouping. And in the silence of the warm nights in Thebes, he could feel the weight of invisible eyes following him, tracking his every move, calculating his next steps. One night, as he walked through the western wing of the palace, something unusual caught his attention. A faint rustle, almost imperceptible, came from one of the side chambers. Kemet, with his ever-sharp senses, followed the sound to a slightly ajar door. Peering inside, he saw two figures conversing in dim light. Their voices were hushed, as if they feared being overheard. One of them was Rhea, one of the pharaoh's key advisors, and the other, a familiar shadow he couldn't quite place. They spoke with urgency, and Kemet didn't need to listen for long to grasp the gravity of the situation. "The pharaoh won't last much longer. You know that?" Rhea's voice sounded bitter. "Kemet may have controlled things for now, but his reign of silence won't last. We're regrouping, and when the time is right, it'll be us standing next to the throne, not him." Kemet's heart raced. He had always known that his role as the pharaoh's guardian and savior of the kingdom would put him on a collision course with many powerful figures. But he hadn't imagined the conspiracy was so far along. In the following days, Kemet began to notice subtle changes in the behavior of those around him. Some guards, who had once greeted him with respect, now averted their gaze. Advisors who frequently sought his counsel now avoided him. But what troubled him most was Rhea's silence. No direct confrontation, but actions that made it clear something was brewing. That's when Kemet realized Amunhotep, though removed from power, was still pulling strings from the shadows. He had woven a network of allies among the discontented advisors and priests, and was now plotting his return. But Kemet knew that if he wanted to stop this new attempt, he would have to act with more cunning than ever. Tension mounted each day. Every move within the palace, every decision made by the pharaoh, revealed signs that the conspiracy was on the verge of erupting. But Kemet needed proof, something concrete to dismantle the plan before they could strike. Then, an anonymous message reached him. A short scroll, delivered in secret by an unknown servant. Inside, only one word was written: meeting, followed by the location of a subterranean chamber, far from the watchful eyes of the palace. That night, Kemet went to the designated location. With a short blade concealed in his robes and his heart pounding, he descended the stone steps into an ancient, forgotten chamber. Upon arriving, he hid in the shadows, observing. In the center of the room, dimly lit by flickering torches, stood Rhea and 4 others, some advisors to the pharaoh, others generals loyal to the throne. In their midst, Amunhotep. "The time is near," Amunhotep said, his voice grave and controlled. "The pharaoh is weak, and Kemet cannot protect the kingdom alone. We will be the new pillars of this government. When the pharaoh falls, we will take control, and Kemet will be eliminated as the obstacle he has become." Kemet felt the tension rise in his chest but remained hidden. He knew this was the moment. He needed to act with precision, as any mistake now could cost him his life. "Tomorrow," Amunhotep continued, "during the temple celebration, we will make our move. Chaos will be our ally, and the pharaoh will not see another sunset." It was all Kemet needed to hear. Slowly retreating to ensure he wasn't seen, he left the chamber. The conspiracy was clear now, and he knew exactly what had to be done. The battle would not be easy, but for the sake of the pharaoh and the kingdom, he would not hesitate to act decisively. That night, while the palace slept, Kemet gathered his most loyal allies. Few knew what was coming, and he intended to keep it that way. With plans laid out and detailed instructions given, they prepared for what would be the decisive moment in Egypt's game of power. The rising sun would usher in a new era for the kingdom, but blood would be shed before victory could be celebrated. And Kemet, always in the shadows, moved the pieces with the precision of someone who knew the true price of betrayal. Suspense hung in the air, and the fate of Egypt rested on the actions of a man who had become far more than just a servant. Now he was the keeper of secrets, the bearer of true power. The dawn arrived with a deceptive calm. The sky, tinged with a soft golden hue, seemed oblivious to the storm of intrigue and betrayal brewing below. Kemet, however, could feel the tension in the air. He had faced many battles in his life, but none like this. The conspiracy he had uncovered the night before now hinged on his judgment. Not only his ability to defeat the conspirators, but how he would administer justice. In the pharaoh's court, where the temple celebration was about to begin, all attention turned to the sacred ritual. The flautist's music echoed through the corridors, and the priests prepared to offer their prayers to the gods. But Kemet knew this would not be an ordinary day. The pharaoh, still weakened, had insisted on attending the temple, and Amunhotep and his allies were ready to exploit the monarch's frailty. As the ceremony unfolded, Kemet watched closely, his eyes never leaving the conspirators. Amunhotep stood at the center, leading the offerings with a calmness that hid the imminent betrayal. Rhea and the generals took their places of honor, masking their intentions under layers of falsehood. Then, at the ceremony's climax, at the moment when the temple was immersed in devotional silence, Kemet made his move. With a discreet signal, his men sprang into action. Loyal guards surrounded the traitors, disarming them before they could react. The chaos Amenhotep had planned swiftly turned against him. The high priest, caught off guard, watched his network of power crumble before his eyes. But before any swords were raised, Kemet lifted his hand, stopping the guards. He walked slowly toward Amenhotep, his eyes locked on the priest. "All of this for power?" Kemet asked in a low, firm voice. "To betray the pharaoh, destroy the kingdom, just to put yourself on the throne?" Amenhotep, his composure crumbling, tried to justify his actions. "I did what was necessary," he replied, desperation masked in his tone. "The pharaoh is weak. Someone had to ensure the survival of the kingdom." "Survival?" Kemet stepped closer, his voice filled with controlled anger. "You wanted power for yourself, to manipulate beliefs and plunge the kingdom into darkness. That's not survival. That's ambition." Silence filled the temple. Everyone awaited Kemet's judgment. He had the power to end it all, to deliver justice with a blade. The traitors awaited their fate, knowing there was no escape. But Kemet, staring into Amenhotep's eyes, remembered something greater. He thought of his own journey, the injustice he had suffered when he was castrated, how life had taken something vital from him and shaped him into something else. And in that moment, as the weight of silence pressed down on everyone, he understood the true meaning of power. "Yes, you betrayed the pharaoh," Kemet said, his voice now gentler, "and justice will be served. But justice isn't always the sword. Sometimes, the burden of forgiveness is far heavier." The guards and advisors exchanged confused glances, but Kemet continued. "Amenhotep, you will be exiled, far from the courts, far from power. I could take your life as you planned to take the pharaoh's, but that would be too easy. The real punishment is to live knowing you failed, that your plans were destroyed, and that Egypt will move forward without your betrayal." Amenhotep, shocked by the decision, lowered his head in silence. Rhea and the other conspirators received similar sentences. All were exiled, banned from Egypt's courts, never to influence the kingdom again. The crowd watched, stunned, as Kemet offered not death, but a different kind of justice. In that moment, he realized that his role was not just that of an executioner. He, who had lost so much, had learned that forgiveness, when given rightly, was a form of power that few understood. Later, when the ceremony ended and the temple stood empty, Kemet walked through the palace gardens. The pharaoh, now recovered from the conspiracy, called him for a conversation. "You could have destroyed them all," said the pharaoh, his voice weak but grateful. "But you chose forgiveness. Why?" Kemet smiled softly, looking out at the golden horizon. "The sword brings fear, your majesty, but forgiveness brings understanding. I know the pain of losing something that can never be recovered. I don't want to be remembered as someone who destroyed, but as someone who gave a second chance. If there is divine favor in me, it is because I've learned that true justice often comes with forgiveness." The pharaoh nodded, silent. He knew Kemet had saved the kingdom, not just from a conspiracy, but from a cycle of violence and vengeance. That day, forgiveness had proven to be more powerful than any sword. And so, Kemet, the keeper of secrets and the silent savior, closed a chapter of his life, knowing that his justice did not come from strength, but from wisdom and the ability to see beyond betrayal.